Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. Today, I want to delve into a definition of the term postcolonialism from different vantage points. Apart from the distinction between the post as a temporal marker and then as the insignia of a particular theoretical orientation, I will also be exploring some of the different forms of colonialism and colonial spacemaking from which postcolonialism derives, some literary texts through which we can understand the concept and its present-day permutations. There are two spellings of the term postcolonialism, one with a hyphen and the other without the hyphen. The one with the hyphen is typically used to refer to the period after colonialism in various parts of the world, while the one without the hyphen is typically used to denote a specific theoretical orientation that has a diverse range of interests. My focus here will primarily be on defining postcolonialism without the hyphen, even though some of what I will be saying will also be pertinent to understanding the different types of colonialism and their historical aftermaths. Understood not as limited to the implicit temporal marking of the post, but as the sign of a critical orientation toward colonialism and its legacies. Postcolonial studies in general have been concerned with the representation of experiences of various kinds, including those of slavery, migration, colonial oppression and resistance, as well as the intersections among race, gender, and sexual identities as the products and responses to the continuing neo-colonial discourses of Euro-America and other parts of the world. Postcolonial theory, on the other hand, pertains to a wide range of theoretical inspirations drawn from Marxism, the works of Michel Foucault, psychoanalysis, and colonial discourse analysis, among others, and applied to a wide range of contexts. Key early exponents of postcolonial theory and of colonial discourse analysis include Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Homi Bhabha, three of the most influential figures in the field. Even though all three theorists worked from English departments, the field has since the 1990s been enlivened by contributions from different disciplines, including especially anthropology, history, and political science. What I am calling colonial discourse analysis itself pays attention to the ways in which language and discourse can be examined to highlight a colonial mentality, even when not focused on colonialism itself, but explored in different contexts that pertain to the relationship between power and representation. Take this spoof illustration of a type of colonial discourse analysis from the satirical magazine The Onion in December of 1995. Please note that what I'm going to read out now contains a number of unpronounceable words. These words will be posted on the screen so that you can catch the humorous tone of the passage. And this is what we see. Clinton deploys vowels to Bosnia. cities of Slibizib Gritnet to be first recipients. Before an emergency joint session of Congress yesterday, President Clinton announced US plans to deploy over 75,000 vowels to the war-torn region of Bosnia. The deployment, the largest of its kind in American history, will provide the region with the critically needed letters A, E, I, O, and U, and is hoped to render countless Bosnian names more pronounceable. For 6 years, we have stood by while names like Yirjev and Chizan and Glirum have been horribly butchered by millions around the world, Clinton said. Today, the United States must finally stand up and say, enough. It is time the people of Bosnia finally had some vowels in their incomprehensible words. The US is proud to lead the crusade in this noble endeavor. The deployment, dubbed Operation Vowel Storm by the State Department, is set for early next week. 2 C-130 transport planes, each carrying over 500 25-count boxes of E's, will fly from Andrews Air Force Base across the Atlantic and drop the letters over the cities. Citizens of Grizny and Shlibozido eagerly await the arrival of the vowels. My God, I do not think we can last another day, Gratitude 44 said. I have children and none of them has a name that is understandable to me or to anyone else. Mr. Clinton, please send my poor, wretched family just one E, please, said Djibouti resident Greg Humphreys, 67. With just a few letters, I could be George Humphreys. This is my dream. The airdrop represents the largest deployment of any letter to a foreign country since 1984. During the summer of that year, the US shipped 92,000 consonants to Ethiopia, providing cities like Wow, Yao, and Ao with vital life-giving supplies of L's, S's, and T's. The consonant relief effort failed, however, when vast quantities of the letters were intercepted and hoarded by violent, gun-toting warlords. This is clearly a satirical take on the reasons for the US's intervention in the Bosnian War that waged from 1992 to 1995 during President Clinton's term in office. It also illustrates the fact that colonialism may be discerned in the realm of international relations between states, where one party tries to impose its values upon another. The link between knowledge, the distribution of vowels, and power, Operation Vowel Storm, seems to have been inspired directly by Edward Said's book Orientalism. Significantly also, the implied rationalization provided that by the recipients of the humanitarian assistance goes to show how the imperial logic tries to find justification from the ranks of the other. The Bosnian Greg Humphreys wants to become George Humphreys, presumably fulfilling an American dream. The passage also attempts to expose the ideological drive behind humanitarian assistance. To justify itself, any propaganda supporting such assistance has to historicize itself in relation to the barbarian impulses of some other places in the world, figured here in the hijacking of the earlier consonant relief efforts to Ethiopia by gun-toting warlords. This history is essentially a form of imperial history and is one in which the propaganda machine feels compelled to manufacture the acquiescence of the beneficiaries of this thinly veiled form of imperialism. All this is conveyed in a language that mimes the propagandist discourse of Western journalism in times of such crises. By rendering these maneuvers in such a half-serious light, however, the passage from the Onion succeeds in exposing the ideologically laden interests of such assistance, whilst at the same time unraveling its central logic by the sheer force of the ridiculousness of its expression. Thus, unlike what pertains in commonplace understandings of the term, it is important to bear in mind that postcolonialism without the hyphen does not refer simply to colonial violence and the resistance toward it, especially as it might be illustrated from certain ex-colonial societies in different parts of the world. But postcolonialism refers to much more wide-ranging and multi-layered social, cultural, and political phenomena. It is also important to note that the term is used to shed light on a spectrum of colonial space-making practices and the socio-political relations that derive from different contexts. However the term is construed, a central underlying assumption is that a focus on the discourse and ideology of colonialism is as important as one on the material effects of subjugation and interracial relations under colonial conditions. Finally, the period of colonialism proper is as important for an understanding of theoretical postcolonialism as are colonialism's aftermath. If postcolonialism without the hyphen is necessarily tied to the colonial past due to the simultaneous temporal and discursive framings of the field, it is the entire domain of what we might describe as colonial spacemaking and its after effects in the contemporary world that gives the term postcolonialism its continuing urgency and significance today. Colonial spacemaking does not merely designate the formation, constitution, and governance of a geographically demarcated area, though that is definitely also important to its meaning. Rather, colonial spacemaking is first and foremost the projection of sociopolitical relations upon a geographical space. Colonial spacemaking is ultimately about the distribution of social and political goods along axes of power and hierarchical relations, and is the result of a series of interconnected and highly complex procedures and instruments. It is undergirded by assumptions, metaphors, and bureaucratic practices, all of which interact within a given social environment to produce hegemonic relations of power. While the hegemonic relations of power and the ideas and assumptions undergirding them may be challenged, The platforms upon which the relations take shape are as much cultural and symbolic as they are political and spatial. Colonial spacemaking is thus defined by sets of relations that were structurally produced and contested across a series of interconnected vectors throughout the long colonial encounter in different parts of the world. And everywhere, colonial spacemaking put into play the intellectual appropriation and symbolic reconfiguration of the relationship between colonizer and colonized, the relationship between different colonized populations, and also that between the colonized and their natural environment. Bearing in mind the caveat that there were many configurations of colonial space making and that in various instances these were not mutually exclusive but were rather mixed and overlapped in specific local context. We can now set out a working inventory of the colonial space making from which to situate different kinds of post-colonial literary representations, critiques, and inflections. And so one was the context of formal colonialism. This involved the establishment of a bureaucratic colonial apparatus comprising legislative and administrative structures, the police, as well as surveys and censuses as the instruments of measurement, enumeration, and control. Additionally, there were attendant cultural institutions such as the colonial church, educational institutions, the theatre, arts councils, and colonial radio and film units, among various others. Most sub-Saharan African countries, India, and Southeast Asia would fall under the rubric of colonialism of the formal kind. There is much postcolonial literature that takes as its theme the institutions of formal colonialism and the resistance against it, such as in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, Willie Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman, and Raja Rao's Kantapura, among various others. The second form of colonial spacemaking was the context of plantation economies. The transformation of plantation slavery into colonialism proper differed from place to place. However, as a general rule, plantation economies were marked not by the paucity or indeed small number of subsistence farms, but by the fact that plantations tended to occupy the most arable and productive lands, and that they were geared predominantly towards export. The colonial machinery deriving from the plantation model that evolved in locations as different as Sri Lanka, Brazil, Jamaica, Malaysia, and the Dominican Republic, and in much of the Caribbean in general, was designed to ensure that products from such places were exported specifically and exclusively to the mother European country, and that their European rivals had limited access to these products. Furthermore, all such contexts also involved the mixing of varying populations of slaves and indentured laborers along with the indigenous populations. And the indentured laborers were transferred from different parts of the world along with the slaves. The British indentured labor policy that was introduced from roughly the 1930s to replace lost labor from slave plantations in the decades after the abolition of slavery in 1807, was in various places used to transfer populations of South Asian and Chinese laborers into plantation economies elsewhere, such as in Trinidad, Guyana, and Barbados. In East Africa, Indian indentured laborers were brought in from the 1830s to the 1920s to help in building the railway system connecting Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Colonial spacemaking of the plantation economy type ensured various degrees of racialization, social segregation, such that the race relations that remained after formal end of colonialism were often marked by animosity and ill will. In Southeast Asia, for example, the British competed for a long time with the Dutch, but gained increasing control over the princely states of Malaya from the mid-19th century onwards. They administered British Malaya until 1957. The British were reluctant to teach English in British Malaya to native Malays, to whom it was introduced slowly and selectively. Colonial administrators were reluctant to change the Malay way of life and create in Malaya the kind of results produced by the policies implemented in India after Sir Thomas Babington Macaulay's infamous Minute on Indian Education in 1835, where the idea was to propagate the English language and its culture in order to create a class of Indian babus that would act as a buffer between the English and their subjects. This also had the effect of producing a large group of disaffected petty clerks who aspired to an English way of life and did not take well to the lowly work allotted to them by their masters. Also, nationalists who taught themselves to ask for European modes of liberty, fraternity, and equality in the colonies, and also writers who dared to emulate the English literary tradition in India. Instead, the British wanted to leave the Malay way of life largely untouched, while introducing many demographic and economic changes that were profitable to their empire, such as importing Chinese labor to work in the tin mines and Indian labor for the rubber plantations, and also for the building of the rail and road networks. After the 1850s, the need to look after the larger interest of those who labored for them eventually obliged the English to formalize and partially subsidize education in British Malaya. But this was done with the proviso that an education in English would be available primarily to the expatriate and immigrant Indian and Chinese, while indigenous Malays were to be taught only in their own language. This was a highly divisive policy whose consequences would help to aggravate ethnic tensions after independence in 1957. From 1963 to 1976, the Malaysian majority, smarting at a century of deprivation, enacted policies that marginalized the immigrant minorities and their languages. English was relegated to a secondary role in higher education, a situation that would change only in the 1990s and only after ugly clashes over several decades between the immigrant Chinese and Indian populations and the dominant Malay community. All these interracial problems in postcolonial Malaysia can be traced back to the British policies enacted during the plantation economy phase. We see similar political and social conflicts in places such as Guyana, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. For more on postcolonialism in Malaysia, see Rajiv Patki's fine essay titled Postcolonial Literature in Southeast Asia in the Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature. The postcolonial literature of former plantation economies refracts these interracial and political tensions, and we read about these variously in the works of Tan Tuan Eng from Malaysia, M.G. Vasanji from Kenya, V.S. Naipaul from Trinidad, Derek Walcott from St. Lucia, Edward Kamal Brathwaite from Barbados, and Louise Bennett from Jamaica, among various others. The third context of colonial spacemaking is the context of settler colonialism. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, Europeans set out to different parts of the world to create settler colonies. The reasons for European migration to the New World varied, but included famine, religious persecution, political upheavals, and dire social problems. The Great Fire of London of 1966, for example, was said to have destroyed over 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and to have decimated or badly affected nearly 70,000 of the then 80,000 population of city inhabitants. Different attitudes generally marked these settler colonies, but at the extreme end was an enclave and segregationist mentality, with strenuous efforts at reproducing the class privileges of the metropolitan center, while keeping the indigenous populations in various forms of servitude. The second attitude of settler colonialism veered between policies of compromise or assimilation and the utter destruction of indigenous populations. Canada, Australia, South Africa, and the United States fall under the rubric of settler colonialism. In this instance, the indigenous population, which are designated variously as First Nations, Aborigines, indigenous people, and natives, find that the settler communities represent a continuing and unbroken paracolonial order against which they have to struggle constantly, as Daniel Heath Justice and Ann Brewster have described for us in their two-part chapter titled Indigenous Writing in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, to be found in the Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature. The term paracolonialism means a state of colonialism without any prospect of independence, but only of unsatisfactory negotiation, compromise, and cohabitation. The writings of Thomson Highway, Canada; Alex Wright, Australia; Witi Ihamera, New Zealand; and Linda Hogan, US, are some of the writers that have explored the continuing impact of settler colonialism on indigenous and aboriginal populations. The fourth context of settler colonialism is the context of migration and diaspora. Apart from the European population dispersals that took place from the 15th to the 19th centuries that we have just alluded to, from the period of formal colonialism from around the 1850s, population dispersal was, if not deliberately designed through policies of colonial governance, such as with the settling of convicts in Australia, or the dispersal of indentured South Asians and Chinese labor that we noted a moment ago, then definitely as an unforeseen consequence of colonial policy mistakes or cock-ups, such as with the 1947 partition of India that displaced millions of people across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. With the rise of the field of modern diaspora studies from the mid-1980s onwards, the concept of diaspora has undergone a number of conceptual changes, several of which may be related to postcolonial studies. Whereas the Jewish, Armenian, Greek, and African American diasporas were always taken to be the classic diasporas until well into the 20th century, the term has come to be applied to various other ethnic and cultural constituencies in scholarly discourse and popular parlance. Key among the changes in the concept of diaspora is the idea that it has to be understood as much in terms of the causative factors that trigger mass population dispersal as in the different relations that are established in time between host land, homeland, and diasporic communities. Depending on the causes of dispersal, myths of homeland and return may either be radically reconfigured or become aggressively attenuated within the diasporic imaginary. Furthermore, the idea of difference from the host land undergoes variations and changes, with certain diasporic groups better able to become integrated into the hegemonic host culture than others. Race and ethnic difference are critical in the constitution of diasporas, as are the inter and intra-ethnic modes of identification and differentiation that have historically informed diasporic groups. Thus, what we describe as the postcolonial literatures of Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and even the United States may productively be understood as literatures of their postcolonial diasporas. With the infusion of new labor populations into the historically white settler colonies of Canada, South Africa, Australia, and to a certain degree, the United States from the mid-1950s, and progressively intensifying in the decades after that, there has also been the production of vibrant diasporic literary cultures with an attendant effort at providing space for the expression of multiple cultural identities. I will later on provide an entire set of episodes on diaspora and diaspora literatures. In addition to the four modes of colonial spacemaking we have just described, we have to note also that colonial spacemaking was an aspect of both external colonialism, which related to the conquest and control of territories, and internal colonialism, which was the management of heterogeneous populations in the name of the empty cipher of the nation, both in Europe and elsewhere. In external colonialism, colonial spacemaking often altered the pre-existing relations among well-constituted local groups, such as in India between the Mughals and the Hindus, or in Nigeria between the northern Muslims and the coastal Yoruba and Igbo. This was an aspect of what is now popularly described as divide and rule, even though the situation was much more complex than that, as Mahmoud Mamdani has instructed us in his book Define and Rule. External colonialism also reconfigured the hierarchies between indigenous and diasporic populations, such as we have already seen with respect to Malaysia, Guyana, and other places. But the control of external territories often went hand in hand with internal colonialism, which took place not on the landscape of external territories, but within the metropolitan center itself. In contrast to external colonialism, then, internal colonialism has to be understood as depending on population management principles, often establishing distinctions between races of the same kind, such as can be amply illustrated historically in the relationship between the English and the Irish in Britain, or in the condition of the Basque separatists in Spain, or of Alsace and Corsica in France. Internal colonialism magnifies the distinctions among races and ethnicities of the same kind, as well as of different kinds, in service of what amounts to forms of colonial regulation and control. The various diasporas from the global south that reside in various metropolises of the global north serve to compound the picture for internal population management even further. Whether in its external or internal variants, colonial spacemaking ultimately involves the differential constitution of citizens and subjects. At any rate, the principle of internal colonialism allows us to apply postcolonial forms of analysis to, for example, China's treatment of the Muslim Uyghur population today, or to Russia's treatment of its Jewish population that was confined to the Pale of Settlement from 1791 to 1917. The point is that viewed from the perspective not of external territorial conquest and control, but rather of the regulation of heterogeneous populations, internal colonialism helps pinpoint different phases of colonial spacemaking practices in places that may not have conventionally been considered to fall under the purview of classic postcolonial studies. The next several episodes will be devoted to exploring the concept of postcolonialism from a variety of perspectives, including from that of education, gender, nature, and intercultural relations, among others. Thank you very much. If you like this episode, remember to give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.